I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is in Washington, my colleague and co-host. And we're keen on the Tibetan New Year. I recall celebrating it a year ago, and it's always a period of celebration and anxiety. Gordon, the anxiety is the Chinese. They're deploying more paramilitary troops. Is this business as usual? No one's surprised in Tibet, Gordon?
Well, I think that this year is worse than before, and in a sense, that's not a surprise because it's been getting worse year after year. But you got to wonder how long they can continue this.
Todd Stein joins us from Washington, where it is snowing, and Gordon's in Washington as well. Director of Government Relations, International Campaign for Tibet. Todd, a very good evening to you. The paramilitary troops, because anticipating the Tibetan New Year, but the Dalai Lama, touring in India, is speaking of hope or better relations with China. Is there evidence of this? Is there any sign from Xi Jinping's government they're going to back off the repression? Good evening to you.
Hi, good evening. Well, Gordon is right that things are bad there, and things seem to be clamped down at this time of year for several years now. But the Dalai Lama is speaking of hope in part because he is trying to encourage the Chinese to get back to the negotiating the table. The Chinese stepped away 4 years ago, and they're putting up all sorts of preconditions on getting back to the dialogue, which the Tibetans and the international community want to see happen. The second thing is that he's privy to information about what Chinese academics are saying, Chinese scholars, the influence of Buddhism that is growing in China, that is coming informed by Tibetan Buddhism. So he's able to see trends there that are going below the surface beyond what we see with Xi Jinping and the paramilitary forces.
Gordon?
Todd, so I guess what you're saying, and I guess this is right, that over the long term, the Tibetans will have a better life in Tibet. But it's going to take some time for that to occur. It would seem that what we're talking about, these long-term trends, may take decades to actually mature.
Yes, and they are very patient people, I have found, of course, inspired by the Dalai Lama's sense of optimism. But you look at other trends around the world. I mean, how long did the Lithuanians wait to be liberated from Soviet domination? And how long, I mean, the conflict in the Middle East has been going on for decades, and it may resolve. So they have to have hope that something will, the political environment in China will change, and that they will be able to sort of take command of their own culture, their own experience at that point.
As I recall, the Tibetan repression going on for several years now is meant to move the Tibetans in some way to accommodate the Chinese Empire or their aggression. Do you see any signs, Todd, that the Tibetans have fallen in line, that the brutality, the response to the self-immolation, which is people wandering around with fire extinguishers on their hips and lining up the streets in Tibet or in the province that's adjacent to Tibet, do you see any signs that the Tibetan people have fallen into line these years?
Well, I don't think you can characterize the whole of the Tibetan people. I mean, there are many Tibetans working within the system imposed by the Chinese to get along economically, to get along professionally. That doesn't mean that they're, conspirators with the Chinese regime necessarily, although there are some Tibetans in positions of authority. But look what happened in 2008, and look what happened, the uprising that happened in the Tibetan Plateau, and look at the self-immolations. These are signs that the system that the Chinese say that they are giving to the Tibetans to make their lives better is not working for the Tibetans. They're very unhappy that their culture is being stolen and their rights are being trampled, and they're expressing their dissatisfaction in many ways.
Gordon?
Well, Todd, as you point out, and I think this is absolutely right, that the Tibetans are a resilient people. They are patient. They've lived in their homeland for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've endured Chinese regimes, some very oppressive, others not, others far away. And yet it seems that Tibet always keeps itself together. That's really what's happening here, I suppose.
Well, the Dalai Lama is fond of saying that, the Chinese Communist Party is 70, well, China under the Communist Party is 70 years old, and Tibetan Buddhism is 1,300 years old. So, which has more chance of lasting? So what he's looking in the long view, in part because he's been reborn 14 times. and you can see that. But he is really looking at the trends of history, and he's just trying to make sure, as he can, that the Tibetan culture, language, and religion survive until political conditions change inside the People's Republic of China.
The People's Republic of China are very unhappy with Spain right now because of Tibet. Why? How so, Todd?
Because Spain has a law called universal jurisdiction, which allows plaintiffs to file claims in their courts against human rights abuses that happen anywhere in the world. You may recall the case of Augusto Pinochet of Chile, the dictator there, who was tried in absentia in Spain. There was a case brought a few years ago accusing China's leaders of gross human rights violations in Tibet, and they won. And that process has led to the arrest warrants for Jiang Zemin and Hu Ping, I believe, who have, were responsible for those policies. But the Chinese come in and they have pressured the Spanish government to change that law, which would have the effect of making the arrest warrants go away. And they had a legislative victory on that, although there are many other steps in the process. So this is really a story of both justice and the Chinese soft power and bullying of medium-sized nations.
Gordon?
Todd, do you think that the Chinese will actually be able to get the law changed? Is this a permanent victory, or is this just one of those temporary things that can be rolled back?
Well, as I understand, I'm not an expert, but that this is the lower house in Spain. Then it goes to the upper house, the Senate, which could take several months. Then there is some form of judicial review or constitutional review of this. So the lawyers that have been advising us, the Spanish lawyers, say there are many points in the process, and it's really up to the Spanish public to raise its voice to say, China, you can't come in and interfere in our internal affairs, which of course China accuses everyone else of doing to them. You can't interfere in our internal affairs and force a change in our law. That's outrageous. We wouldn't accept it here in the United States, and hopefully the Spanish people won't accept it.
The Tibetan New Year, the beginning of March, do the Chinese authorities suppress it? Do they acknowledge it? Do they ignore it?
Well, I would use the word co-opt it. Now, the Chinese and Tibetan New Years are lunar New Years. They do not always, sometimes they happen on the same day and sometimes they don't. Again, they are separate traditions by distinct cultures. The Chinese one just happened, a week or two ago, and the Tibetan one called Losar happens on March 2nd. And what the Chinese do is they made a big splash about how Tibetans are celebrating Chinese New Year, which is kind of bogus because Tibetans already have their New Year on March 2nd. And so you'll see the security presence that you mentioned around Tibetan towns to make sure that there's no expression of Tibetan nationalism on what is a cultural and religious holiday.
Tibet. 1,000 years ago, Tibet was a power, an empire, and China was fractured and looked to Tibet with great concern because the Tibetan armies were all powerful. Tibet chose a peaceful way. 1,000 years later, China's the brute. Todd Stein, Director of Government Relations at the Campaign for Tibet, Gordon Chang, and I'm John Batchelor.